All right. Efilism. I'm going to analyze and critique Efilism. And this is going to take a while. But it will be shorter than Inmendham's 7,000 videos on the subject. Has he made I don't know how many videos he's made. He probably has something like 5,000 hours of video, I would guess. Anyway, this is going to be a more concise presentation of Efilism, and it's not just a presentation of the philosophy of Efilism, it is also going to be a critique of it. And I'm going to try to pack that all into a fun-filled hour or so. So what is Efilism? Efilism is the philosophical rejection of life. The term Efilism comes from life spelled backwards. Life spelled backwards is Ephil, and thus Efilism. As far as I know, Inmendham coined the term and invented the philosophy, at least in the form that I'm going to present here. Other people have viewed life as bad, either emotionally or perhaps philosophically, but not based on the same philosophical arguments. So what I'm going to present is Inmendham's worldview as I understand it. I have to add that caveat because he might not agree if he listens to this. We'll see. Okay, so here are the foundations of Efilism. As I understand it, these are the foundations of Inmendham's worldview. The first is evolution, or more broadly, biological realism. And one of the important implications of the theory of evolution is that life is selfish and violent. This is very hard for most people to accept, that life is not it's not a little cartoon pony thing. It is creatures killing and eating each other. All right, the second foundation is asymmetry. This is a claim about psychology, that life has more pain than pleasure. Then you have hedonism, which is the belief that pleasure is intrinsically good, pain is intrinsically bad, and nothing else matters. Nothing else is intrinsically valuable. Only pain and pleasure. And finally, altruism, the belief that we have a moral duty to others, and in the Efilist version of morality, we have a duty toward all sentient life. All right, now I'm going to expand on these foundations. Evolution. Life is intrinsically selfish and violent. Human beings do not transcend evolution or biology with our wonderful brains or our, anything else about us, our consciousness or anything like that. This is built into the nature of life because life reproduces to excess, and then the excess is culled because there is a competition over finite resources. So many more are created than could possibly make it to adulthood and reproduce themselves. An example that Inmendham often uses is the octopus. An octopus will have, if it lives to adulthood, if it lives to maturity and mates, then a female octopus might have 10,000 eggs. And these eggs will all hatch into little baby octopuses. The female will guard the eggs and eventually probably die as a consequence of her reproductive act and her sacrifice on behalf of her babies. And then these 10,000 little babies will go out into the world and start getting eaten by sharks and moray eels and all kinds of other creatures, right? And out of that 10,000, on average, only 2 can live to adulthood to start the cycle over again, right? Because if more than 2 lived to maturity and did the same thing, then the population would explode, right? So this is built into the nature of life. Life is constrained by competition, and therefore life is intrinsically selfish and violent. Well, that's why it's intrinsically violent and it's intrinsically selfish, because organisms are selected to reproduce, which is a selfish act. It's selfish in the sense that it's for the perpetuation of your genetic information. It's not for the perpetuation of others or to make others feel good or, anything else. We're not selected to do anything other than reproduce. And to do that, we have to compete with others. So that's why we are selfish and violent, like every other life form. And also, the cosmos as a whole has no purpose. This is like the rejection of a religious or mystical view of the cosmos and humanity's place within the cosmos and within nature. Inmendham has what you could call a naturalistic view, a view that is limited to physics and biology. It does not contain any spiritual or phantasmagorical components. All right. The next one is asymmetry. The asymmetry claim is that life has more pain than pleasure. Now, I want to point out this because it's kind of important. This is a truth claim about the nature of subjective experience. So that makes it kind of interesting because usually when we make truth claims, we are making them about objective reality, right? Like I might say, there's milk in the fridge. That's a truth claim about objective reality. And most of our truth claims are about objective reality. But if I were to say, I feel sad, that is a truth claim about my subjective experience. The asymmetry claim is a claim about the general nature of subjective experience, that it has more bad feelings than good feelings. And there are two different arguments that I've heard Inmendham make for this view. I should have said, by the way, that pain, the way I'm using it here, covers all negative emotional experiences. So it's not just physical pain like stubbing your toe or having a headache or something like that. It covers all negative emotions like sadness, fear, anger, anything that's got a negative aspect to it. Any kind of emotional experience that feels bad is what I mean by pain. And Inmendham often uses the word suffering for this. So anyway, the first argument is that pain or suffering is the primary form of emotional experience, and pleasure is just a reduction, so a secondary aspect of it, a reduction in it. So the real thing is the suffering, and then if you reduce the suffering, you take away the need or the deprivation, then you feel pleasure. And this argument implies that for every sentient being, life has more pain than pleasure. The second argument I've heard him make is that life has more losers than winners, based on, our understanding of evolution, which I just talked about, that there are more losers than winners, more baby octopuses that get chewed up by sharks than, get to grow up and have orgasms. So even if some sentient beings have a great life, the orgasm at the end it makes it all worthwhile, most of them just end up getting eaten by the shark. So on average, or, in the great majority of cases, life is more bad than good. And I should point out that the first argument is about the asymmetry of psychology. The second is about the asymmetry of biology. So there are two different kinds of asymmetries that Inmendham appeals to when he's making the argument for the asymmetry of emotional experience. And it matters a little bit which of these arguments you believe, but it doesn't really affect the conclusion very much. Okay, the next one is hedonism. Hedonism is the view that pain and pleasure are the ultimate source of value. Pain is definitively bad, pleasure is definitively good. This is the foundational value assumption of Efilism. This view is presented as self-evident. It is presented as a self-evident truth that requires no justification. So it's not presented as a claim, like as a truth claim that might require some, empirical argument to justify it. Inmendham presents it as obvious or even sometimes as logical. If people disagree with him on this, he usually just dismisses them by calling them a nihilist or something like that. All right, so I've never heard him make any actual argument for this claim. He just seems to think it is a self-evident truth that requires no justification. I'll talk a little bit at the end about his fallacies and his rhetoric as it relates to this assumption. And it's important to note that hedonism situates value within subjectivity. So it's not out there in the objective world. It's not what you do in the world. It's not what happens in the world. It's just how you feel that matters. It doesn't matter whether you're on a virtual reality headset in a flotation tank or you're doing something in the real world. All that matters is whether you have good or bad feelings, pleasure or pain. All right. And then altruism. Altruism is the belief that we have a moral duty to others. Efilists believe that we have a moral duty to all sentient beings, all beings capable of feeling pleasure and pain. So there's some kind of obligation that exists in the world, or I don't know where it's supposed to come from, but there is some obligation that we have to others. And this is the foundational moral principle of Efilism. As with hedonism, it is presented as self-evident. And unlike hedonism, altruism situates morality in objectivity, in objective reality. Because to you, other minds are out there. They're not in here. They're not in your subjectivity, even though they might, that their feelings are in their subjectivities. But from your perspective, that's out there in the objective world. So there is a kind of conflict between these two value assumptions. The core value assumption, the individual value assumption, like what is good for you and what is bad for you, and the moral value assumption, which is what is morally good, or I guess what is objectively or universally good. There is a kind of conflict. I'm not saying that there is a contradiction exactly, but there is a kind of conflict in this, which I'll explain later. I'll try to. It's a little bit hard to explain. All right, so those were the foundations of Efilism, and from those foundational beliefs, it is very easy to derive the claim that life is bad. Hedonism and asymmetry together imply that life is bad. Now, depending on which argument you make for asymmetry, it might be bad for every sentient being or just bad for most sentient beings. But either way, you get the general claim that life is bad. Altruism then implies that we ought to reduce or eliminate sentient life, that it would be immoral to create sentient life, and it would be moral to prevent it, to prevent life from ever existing in the future. So if you had the big red button that you could press and wipe out all life on the planet or in the universe, it would be moral to do that, because that would prevent harm. If life is harmful, then destroying all life prevents harm, right? And in this worldview, there is no greater purpose. There is nothing else to do, right? The absence of life would not cause any problems for anyone because there wouldn't be anyone to be inconvenienced by it, right? So this is Inmendham's non-existent Martian argument that he makes a lot. But basically the point is that life doesn't have some greater purpose. It's not a cog in some big machine. It's not doing something that's good on a larger scale. So eliminating it would not cause any harm to anything. And that's Efilism in a nutshell. All right. Now, my views. I agree with the Efilist understanding of nature and the cosmos, more or less. However, I disagree with the other foundations. I disagree with the asymmetry claim. I reject hedonism, I reject altruism, and I affirm life and reproduction. So you could say in a way, I'm the opposite. I'm a reproducer, a lifist. Okay, so I'm going to briefly give I'm going to give an overview of my theory of desire. Okay, my understanding of the psychology of desire, because this is very important for the asymmetry claim and the hedonism idea. I'm going to critique both of those But first I'm going to have to give my understanding of the psychology of desire. All right, so desire is the psychological mechanism that motivates and evaluates actions. It also evaluates other things, like, we have emotional attachments to objects and people and stuff like that. But the function of desire is to generate effective action, to make you act in the world toward your biological purpose of reproduction. Every one of your desires is it's an evolved heuristic that in the past helped your ancestors to reproduce or caused them to act in ways that led to reproduction, right? So for example, you have the desire to eat. You feel hungry, you eat, then the desire fades away. That makes you feel good, and the desire goes away, and then you stop eating, right? Well, that emotion regulates your food intake, and of course you need food to survive, grow, act in the world, and ultimately to reproduce. So that's part of being an effective reproducing machine, eating. And everything else that you have a desire for is linked in some way back to reproduction. So all of your desires ultimately serve the goal of reproduction. But you don't have a reproduction desire, okay? Because you just don't. You have a whole bunch of little desires that all together, they are activated in different situations by different things, and they caused your ancestors to do things like, eat and have sex and love their children and raise them up and so on and so forth. And those actions led to reproduction, and that's why you're here. Desire, like everything else about you, is an evolved mechanism for generating effective action. And what we experience as pain and pleasure are the subjective experiences of motivation and evaluation, or changes in those states. And they motivate you to act toward goals and away from bad things. So they basically motivate you to go toward things that are beneficial to you in terms of helping you to reproduce, and go away from things that are harmful to you. So we have motivations that are away from things and toward things. And even the motivation that's toward something, you can introspect about this a little bit. It feels bad, right, to want somebody. Like, think about unrequited love. It's a desire for something, but if you don't get the thing, then that feeling, that frustrated love, it feels bad when it wells up in your heart and you feel miserable because you can't have that person, right? So motivation, the creation of motivation feels bad. The elimination of motivation feels good, right? Hunger is a very simple example, right? If you're hungry, as you get hungry, that feels bad. And the worse your hunger gets, the worse you feel. But then that makes the food taste better. You feel better when you eat if you're hungry before you eat. If you're not hungry, you don't feel good when you eat. If you're very hungry, it feels very good to eat. So there's a balance. And I'm not going to be able to fully persuade you of this right now, probably, because I don't think I have enough time to go through the full analysis of desire and pain and pleasure and subjectivity. But I will tell you what I believe, what I have come to believe after thinking about this a lot. And maybe in the future I will make a presentation about desire specifically and focus on that and go through all the arguments and stuff. What I believe is that there is a balance between pain and pleasure, that pain and pleasure are symmetric. They are tied together. So my view is similar in a way to Inmendham's idea that pain is the primary thing and pleasure is the secondary thing. But what I believe is that motivation is the primary underlying variable. Pain is experienced when motivation increases, and pleasure is experienced when it decreases. I will not tell you to experiment with opiate drugs, because that would be a mistake, but if you have ever taken opiate drugs for some kind of medical condition, then you have experienced the sudden reduction in all of your desires, right? You take an opiate drug and all the desires go away. You don't feel itchy or tired or hungry or cold or anything. You just feel kind of warm and fuzzy. Just feel good. And then you kind of, you're just relaxed. But when the drug wears off, it all comes back. All the bad stuff, all the motivations, all the desires come back. All right, so I believe that pain and pleasure are symmetric, and thus, if I were a hedonist, it simply wouldn't matter what I did with my life. It wouldn't make any difference. In the short run, it would matter. Like in the short run, I could make myself feel bad. I could hit my hand with a hammer, and that would feel bad. But if I did that, then eventually I would feel the pleasure of, recovering from that injury, right? Like you can feel pleasure when you recover from an illness that you would not have felt if you had not been ill. You feel pleasure when you eat after going without food for a long time that you would not have felt if you had not gone hungry. So I believe that it all balances out. There's no net gain or loss in terms of the total amount of pain and pleasure. It just adds up to nothing. So I suppose I will say, in response to Inmendham's slightly condescending video title of 2 plus 2 equals 4, I will just say 2 plus negative 2 equals 0. All right, now I will give a critique of hedonism. Hedonism is an unjustified assumption. So that's the main critique. It's just an assumption. There's no a priori reason that we are compelled to view pain as bad and pleasure as good. Yes, pain feels bad by definition. Pain is bad feeling. Pain is a negative feeling and pleasure is a positive feeling, but that doesn't mean that we must philosophically view those feelings as having positive and negative value in some ultimate or objective sense, or even in any sense, even in a personal sense, even in a personal subjective sense. Feeling and being are different things. Feeling good and being good are different things. So this is not a self-evident truth. As I have said, pain and pleasure are symmetric, and so hedonism is futile. So that's one reason why it doesn't provide a foundation for anything. It doesn't tell you what to do because it doesn't matter what you do. There are a couple of interesting consequences that arise when you situate value within subjectivity. So first of all, the way I use the term value, it is a subject-object relation. The subject values something in objective reality. So if you value something within your subjectivity, then this valuing arrow, let's think of it as an arrow, it goes out of you and then circles back and goes into your head, kind of, it sort of points back into your subjectivity and says, I value valuing. Because when I, feel positively about something, that is valuing it, right? Like loving my child, that's of valuing. Emotions are about valuing outcomes, valuing objects, valuing actions. But if you value your pain and pleasure, then you value valuing. And this is a kind of, I guess it's kind of a vacuous circle. Another problem with hedonism is that pain and pleasure are transient. And the same thing is true of all subjective experiences. They are all transient. They exist only in the moment. You cannot store pain and pleasure in your brain, right? There is no stack of pain and stack of pleasure there that you've stacked up over a lifetime that you're accumulating. They exist only in the moment. In fact, you can't even remember pain and pleasure. You can remember that, when I broke my leg, it hurt, and I was groaning, and I was in pain, but you can't feel that pain again. It isn't stored anywhere. You have a memory of being in pain, but you don't have the pain itself stored. And the same thing is true of pleasure. And there's a good reason for that. We don't need to store these things, and if we did, then, we might just spend our lives, internally fapping to our memories, right? But we can't, because we can never re-experience those experiences. They are only there in the moment, and then they are gone. Does it make sense to situate value in something that only exists for basically an infinitely small moment, right? That exists only in the moment, that does not have any permanence, any real existence. And then also, subjectivity as a whole is transient. You will sometimes hear Inmendham talking about how the universe is going to come to an end and everything is going to be destroyed, so nothing matters. Everything is going to be destroyed, so whatever we do is just folly because it's all going to get wrecked. Well, maybe, probably, I don't know. But that's even more true of subjectivity. I mean, first of all, you're not even storing up pain and pleasure anyway, so what's the point of trying to get more of one than the other when they're gone as soon as you experience them? But also the subjectivity itself is transient. It's this bubble, the self that emerges because of the brain, and then when you die, it's gone. The entirety of it is gone, right? Your memories, everything is gone. So even your memories of those experiences will be gone. So does it make sense to situate value within this transient bubble of subjectivity? I'm not saying that these are necessarily arguments against hedonism. I think I've already made my strongest arguments against it, but I mention these to demonstrate that it is not some kind of self-evident truth, but that instead it has a lot of really big issues, really big problems. Like, what could be more futile than trying to act into yourself, than valuing? All right, so I went through hedonism. Oh yes, altruism. All right, I have given critiques of altruism before, and some of you might know, if you've followed me for a while, that I reject morality entirely. I don't think there is any such thing as good or evil out there in the cosmos or in nature. Altruism is an unjustified assumption, just like hedonism. It's not a self-evident truth. It can be questioned. It can be rejected. And I reject it. I reject it as a kind of delusion. I think it's a lie. We're not altruistic. Even some people might do things that are sort of altruistic, but even then the underlying motivation is selfish. It's just that they're kind of fucked up and they're doing some weird thing. They're doing some distorted version of selfishness. Or they're just lying or pretending or whatever. Or they're cooperating. And there are moral values, and they do matter to society. If people were smart enough, we probably wouldn't need them, but I guess we need them because people don't understand what's going on in society. Basically, moral values are created by humans. They are intersubjective. They are things that we create by agreeing on them. Just like we make money valuable by believing in it, essentially. We create moral values by believing in them together. And I'm not going to go off on a big tangent about this because I have talked about this before. So maybe I'll leave links to my discussions of morality and altruism in the description. But anyway, it should be clear that there's no morality out there. Like, nature doesn't have it, right? And the Ephilists admit that. They view nature as basically evil, right? Nature is selfish and violent. It's not altruistic and lovey-dovey. It's not My Little Pony. And there's no morality in the cosmos, the stars and galaxies swirling around, and, matter and energy doing its thing. And none of that has any morality in it. So where do the Ephilists think this morality comes from? It doesn't just pop out of logic, nothing pops out of logic. My view is that morality is a delusion. It's the big moralistic fallacy, I guess. It's like people make this really big moralistic fallacy, which is that their moral values are somehow the moral values. Anyway, like I said, I've talked about this quite a bit in the past, so I'll just leave it there. and I'll post some links. Now I'm going to talk about some of the fallacies that Inmendham commits when he is defending his assumptions from criticism. I have seen him use the following fallacies. Appeal to intuition, which is pretty much the same as appeal to common sense or obviousness. Begging the question. Tactical reductionism, and metaphorical externalization. And now I will expand on each of these. Appeals to intuition. Inmendham very often uses rhetoric that appeals to intuition, or in other words, to common sense. For example, he'll say things like, eating a cupcake is good, having a nail in your eye is bad. And if you can't understand that, you're just too fucking stupid. And this misses the point. It misses the point of somebody questioning hedonism. Eating a cupcake might feel good, but that doesn't mean that it is intrinsically good. And there's a kind of irony here because Inmendham is appealing to common sense or intuition, right? It's just like, oh, this is just obvious. Eating a cupcake is good, and if you can't see that, you're an idiot. Well, it's a common sense, obvious belief that life is good and death is bad, right? Inmendham is arguing against common sense. He's arguing for a very counterintuitive belief system. So it's kind of ironic that when it comes to his core assumptions, he thinks it's adequate to just appeal to common sense or intuition. All right, how Inmendham begs the question. He often uses the words selfish or selfish clunt and nihilist as insults, and also as a kind of substitute for arguments. These labels are used to insult and dismiss anyone who questions his assumptions of hedonism and altruism. This implicitly begs the question, because the insults presuppose the assumptions. Calling somebody selfish is not an insult if they reject altruism. Because if they don't accept your moral belief in altruism, then they would just say, yes, I am selfish. That is true, right? It's kind of like a Muslim insulting a Christian by saying that he rejects the Prophet Muhammad. The Christian would just say, yes, that's right, I reject the Prophet Muhammad. Right? It's not an insult if you agree with it. And the term nihilist is used by a lot of people when somebody doesn't agree with one of their assumptions, right? As if, well, if you don't agree with my assumptions, you're a nihilist. You can't have any assumptions that aren't mine. And being a nihilist is just something bad, and I don't have to defend that. It's just bullshit. It's not an argument, right? I mean, calling somebody a nihilist as if it's an insult is not an argument. The person might just say, yes, I'm a nihilist, that's right, I don't have any values. Okay, that's possible. It's a philosophical position that's just as valid as Efilism. Or the person might say, no, I just don't share your values. That doesn't make me a nihilist. But either way, calling the person a nihilist is not an argument. All right, almost done. Tactical reductionism. Inmendham often dismisses life-affirming values on the grounds that life is just a replicating molecule and thus presumably meaningless. Right? How could it mean anything if it's just a replicating molecule? Well, this is a kind of trick. If you view anything from an objective standpoint, like from the standpoint of science, the value in it disappears because the value only exists within a subjective perspective. Without a subject that values something, there is no value in it. So you can remove the appearance of value from anything by looking at it scientifically, right? This is a very common, it's almost like a little intellectual game that people play. They'll say, well, love is just oxytocin, it's just chemicals. Sure, it's just chemicals, but that doesn't mean it has no value. And also, you could apply the same kind of reductionism to Inmendham's values. to pleasure and pain, and especially to the pleasure and pain of other organisms. Because these things are just chemical reactions. All of the things that Inmendham values are just chemical reactions in blobs of jelly. But he never describes them that way. He always describes the things he values from some kind of subjective perspective, right? It might be he describes his own feelings, or he tries to get you to put yourself in the shoes of another sentient being and imagine being tortured. He never looks at it through the scientific lens and says, oh, well, it's just chemical reactions in a jelly blob. Like I could have a little rat brain in a jar here on my desk that was hooked up to some electrodes. And if I press one button, then that stimulates one part of the brain and the brain feels pain. If I press another button, it feels pleasure. But it's just a blob of jelly, and all I'm doing are changing electrical potentials at points within that blob of jelly. Right? So you can always look at it in a way that makes the things that you personally value or that seem meaningful to you disappear. And you can do this in other ways too. You can stare up at the night sky and say, look, in the vast scheme of the entire universe, what does anything matter? Well, of course, the value disappears when you look at it on this vast scale. Because, of course, on a big enough scale, nothing you do is going to have any visible effect, right? You can only act locally onto the, local environment. And so, yeah, you can do lots of things like that, lots of perspective shifts or whatever to eliminate the perception of value. And what this demonstrates is that value is subjective. It's built into the way we see the world as sentient beings, as conscious beings, as, reproducing machines with blobs of jelly in skulls. But that does not mean that there is no value. What it means is that value is not objective. That meaning exists only between a subject and something out there in objective reality. It does not exist in objective reality alone. And finally, externalizing metaphors. This is something that the MGTOWs used to do. They would externalize sexual desire. They would, talk about you being a puppet of your sexual desire or rising above it or something like that. Inmendham uses metaphors that externalize DNA and biology in general. He will say things like, should we just do what the DNA tells us to do? Should we take orders from a molecule? These are metaphors, right? The DNA does not tell us anything. This kind of metaphor, DNA telling us something or whatever, controlling us, whatever, is a way of externalizing DNA. It kind of places it metaphorically outside us. So it's not part of us, it's this other thing, and we should not, listen to it or be controlled by it. We should free ourselves from it or something like that. But in fact, we are DNA molecules, or at least we are the expression of DNA molecules and other information that is stored in our cells. DNA is intrinsic to us, right? It's not external. It is internal, and it's really the most intrinsic thing about you, because it's really the one constant throughout your life. Your memories will change, your experiences will change you, you'll be shaped in various ways, you will grow. Most of the molecules in your body will be replaced during your life. But the information content of your DNA, the information that you inherited from your parents, is relatively constant. It does degrade during your life, but as it degrades, you degrade, and eventually you die. I think it is the most intrinsic aspect of you. It is the biggest part of your identity. So to externalize this metaphorically is a trick. It's a lie. You can't be pulled on the strings of your DNA or have your DNA boss you around or anything like that. No, you are an expression of your DNA. Or you could just say you are a bunch of DNA molecules. Okay, so I'm going to just wrap this up by talking about philosophy a little bit. Because as I said at the beginning, Efilism is a philosophical worldview. Philosophy begins with a critique of ordinary assumptions the things that we take for granted, right? The things that most people take for granted as they go about their lives, like, truth. What is truth? How do I know that there's a tree there when I see a tree? What should I do with my life? Most people have some idea of what they should do with their life, but they've never really thought about it beyond a certain point. And beyond that point, there are assumptions. And philosophy begins at that point, when you start questioning those assumptions and maybe rejecting some of them or changing some of them or trying to justify them. So philosophy is an attempt to construct a rational basis for existence rather than relying on assumptions. And to have a rational worldview, you must examine every assumption. You cannot hold anything off limits to questioning. And in this way, Efilism is more rational than the ordinary worldview, by far. Because it has questioned a lot of things. It has questioned whether or not life is worth living. That's an assumption. Most people just assume life is good. Efilism questions that assumption and rejects it. It questions a bunch of our, kind of naive, mystical notions about life and nature and stuff like that as well. So Efilism is more rational than the ordinary worldview, but it still retains unexamined assumptions, specifically hedonism and altruism. And I think what happened with Inmendham when he was young is that he had these assumptions, as I did, and he saw that they conflicted with nature, right? He saw that there was this conflict, especially between altruism and the reality of nature. That nature is brutal. It's not nice. It's not a nice little cartoon. It's a struggle. And it's full of violence and selfish organisms, consuming each other. And I think he was sort of horrified by this, and he did not, however, question his faith in altruism or in hedonism. When I was young, I noticed the same thing. I noticed this conflict between nature and goodness, and my notion of goodness, which was similar to his. But instead of rejecting nature or rejecting life, I questioned morality. I questioned altruism, and I rejected it. And then later in life, I rejected hedonism by the same kind of process. I started thinking about it. I noticed that, it didn't seem like you could really get ahead playing the game. I did not come to the conclusion that you were always behind, like in Inmendham. Well, I guess you're always behind a little bit in my view, until the very end. But I didn't come to the conclusion that you were overwhelmingly behind in the pleasure-pain game. But I saw it instead as a kind of, a treadmill, a hamster wheel mechanism. That it's not there to make us feel good. It's there to make us do things. So there's no reason why evolution would create a mechanism that makes you happy, right? It would create a mechanism that makes you reproduce, that makes you always dissatisfied, always seeking, always struggling, always trying to get more. So I realized that when I was a teenager. And so I rejected hedonism as well, because I recognized that it was unfulfillable. But this also led me to question the assumption of hedonism. So I didn't just question whether I could win at the game. I also questioned the game. I questioned the assumption that pleasure was good and pain was bad. And I rejected that as well. So I have gone beyond, gone deeper down the philosophical rabbit hole than Inmendham. And I see where he kind of copped out, or where he couldn't go beyond, couldn't stare at the abyss, the real abyss. He's staring at the abyss that nature sucks, life sucks, and all that. There's an even deeper abyss to stare at, which he never got to. You got to get way down to see that abyss. Get rid of all your assumptions. You really have to be a nihilist before you can be anything else. Before you can be rational about life, you have to first be a nihilist. You have to stare into the abyss long and hard. All right, this is the final slide. Efilism, nihilism, or lifeism. There is no a priori foundation for value. We are not compelled to accept any value premise. We are not forced to accept or reject life or anything else. We are free in that sense. This is kind of a catch-22 of subjectivity, that we are free, but we don't have any good basis for making an ultimate decision about what to do. However, we do have a kind of objective purpose. There are things that are objectively good and bad for humans. That doesn't mean we have to subjectively adopt them as values, but we are what we are. We are reproducing machines. And our objective purpose is to reproduce. And as I said before in Lucifer's question, even if you reject life, you are still a reproducing machine. Even if you choose not to reproduce, you are still a reproducing machine. You are just a defective reproducing machine. But it doesn't change what you are, what you objectively are. Nothing is going to change that. That doesn't mean that you are forced by logic or anything else to reproduce. You aren't. You have a choice. You can choose. And I choose to be an effective reproducing machine. I choose to be good at what I am. I affirm life. Thanks for listening.